So this is a supplemental lecture on the difference between validity and soundness. This comes up with at least one, usually multiple students every semester. So I figured I would make just a quick supplemental video about the difference. Now, I go over this in other video lectures, of course, but this is specifically going to kind of elaborate on it a little bit in some ways that I don't elaborate in other videos on deductive logic. So let me share my screen here. So I remember the first time I took a logic course back in, it was a while now, 1994, 1995, something like that. And I remember learning about the difference between validity and soundness, one class. And I went up to my teacher afterwards and I said, well, I don't really understand what the difference is. I mean, if just because it has a certain form, doesn't that make it sound? And he said, no, that makes it valid. And I said, well, what would make it sound? And he said, well, the premises have to be true. And as long as the premises are true and the argument form itself is valid, then you'll have a sound argument. And I said, oh, so you can have a valid argument with false premises. And as long as the argument itself conforms to a certain structure or form or is considered deductive, then it will always be valid. And he said, yeah. And I said, oh, okay. And it just kind of clicked. So hopefully, after I go over this, the difference between the two will make a little more sense. So let me go full screen here. Okay. Let me get my face a little bit out of here. So, all right, review really quick. We're talking about deductive logic, and a valid argument in deductive logic is an argument with a form such that if the premises are true, we can be certain that the conclusion is also true. There are different ways of stating this. And I restate the definition of valid, in a few slides from now. So I'll do that in a moment, but think about it. Pause the video. Think about how you can say what a valid argument is in a way that's essentially the same or has the same meaning as what I have here, because there are a couple of different ways of saying what a valid argument is. But we know that a valid argument is an argument in which the premises are true and that the conclusion that follows is also true, and it has to be true, and that's just given its form. So an invalid argument then is an argument with a form such that it's possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false. So if the premises are true and it's not possible for the conclusion to be false, then we have a valid argument. If the premises are true and it is possible for the conclusion to be false still, then that's an invalid argument. And we've learned so far that essentially a valid argument just is a deductive argument. A valid argument is a deductive argument that has a deductive form. Now, many arguments appear to be deductive in form, but in fact they're not. And at the end of this, I'll give you an example of one. I also give an example of one at the end of our lecture on categorical logic, when we look at all the Venn diagrams and different instantiations of valid argument forms in categorical logic. But thus, if a valid argument just is a deductive argument, true to form, true to a deductive form, then an invalid argument just is the definition of an inductive argument. Remember what an inductive argument is. An inductive argument just is an argument in which it's possible to have true premises, but a false conclusion. Remember? So I just gave you the definition of an inductive argument, and it's the same exact definition of what an invalid argument is. They both have the same definition. Therefore, invalid arguments and inductive arguments, we would say, are equal or they're equivocal. They're the same thing. So technically, a valid argument that is an argument that has a form in which the premises are true and the conclusion necessarily follows and is thus also true, just is and only applies to a deductive argument. Okay, so that's the difference between a valid and invalid argument. But what does it mean for an argument to be sound? So a sound argument is an argument that's valid. So it's an argument that has a deductive form, a true deductive form, or a deductive argument that is true to form. And in fact, the premises are true. So if you have a valid argument, and in fact, the premises are true, the conclusion that follows, we know, will also have to be true. And we just call that a sound argument. So a sound argument has two conditions. It has to be valid, so it has to be a deductive argument. It has to have a deductive form. And further, the premises themselves have to be true. So the best kind of argument you can make is a sound argument. If you can make a sound argument, you're golden. That means you have a valid form. You always want your you always want to conform to a deductive form. And moreover, more importantly, a good argument is going to have true premises. A bad argument is going to have false premises. You don't want to make an argument in which the one or more of the premises can be proven false, right? That ruins the argument altogether. So sound arguments are really important because you can be certain that the conclusion's true because you have true premises. And I'll give some examples of that in a moment. So that's review. That's stuff that we already know. We've discussed this over the semester. So an argument, valid argument, again, is an argument with a form such that if the premises are true, we can be certain that the conclusion is also true. But why? Why now? Like I've been talking about form, right? And we've discussed this a little bit, but let's look a little bit closer at form. And I've gone over this more in depth in other lectures, but kind of took the essence of what's in those lectures and compiled them here. So hopefully we can get a better understanding of what a deductive argument form is going to look like, at least one or two of them, not all of them, because there are a number of, as we've studied, a number of valid forms, but we're just going to look at a couple of them and look at the forms themselves to try to understand what the form is and why it's valid. So a logical form is a pattern of reasoning, or it's a law of logic, that any argument that conforms to the pattern will always be valid. So we can have different patterns of reasoning. Some will guarantee the truth of the conclusion if the premises are true. And we call those argument patterns or argument forms valid. So we can have forms, logical forms or pattern of reasoning in which it's possible to have true premises, but a conclusion that either doesn't follow from the premises or is possible to be false. And when we have that logical form or pattern of reasoning, we call it invalid. So the logical form of a valid argument is going to be a very kind of specific structure and construction of the sentences, and then the reasoning from the sentences, or what we would call premises, to the conclusion. So let's look at forms. So remember, we're going to be looking at a categorical syllogism. These are fairly easy to understand. The concept of validity, the concept of soundness, and what a logical form is. So we've looked at a couple of valid forms like modus ponens and modus tollens and disjunctive syllogism and so forth in propositional logic, but we're just going to look at categorical logic to understand, or I should say, to review what the form is in categorical logic. But the same principles about valid forms will apply across different types of logic. So remember, we are assigning variables, that is, we assign letters to represent, kind of in the abstract, the subjects and predicates of the argument premises or the argument sentences. So the subject, of course, is, just what the subject or what the sentence is about, or what's being described, or who the sentence is about, or who's being described. That's just the subject of the sentence, of course. A predicate is what or how the subject is being described. So an adjective, for example, that describes a subject just is the predicate of the sentence. So every new subject or predicate introduced in an argument needs a new variable or letter to represent it. So letters cannot be repeated for new subjects and predicates. So for example, let's look at this argument. We're familiar with this one. All humans are mammals. What's the subject? What's it about? What's the sentence about? It's about humans. So humans is the subject. How are humans being described? They're being described as mammals. So mammals is the predicate. Now let's look at the second sentence. Socrates is a human. What's this what or who is the sentence about? Well, it's about Socrates. And how is Socrates being described? It's being described as a human. So Socrates is the subject, human is the predicate. So even though human in the first sentence is the subject and human in the second sentence is a predicate, the term human represents the same thing. It represents kind of the same phenomenon that exists in the world. So we're going to give it a variable here in the first sentence, and since the term is being used again in the second sentence, we use the same variable. So lastly, the conclusion. What can we conclude from these two premises? That Socrates is a mammal. Why? Well, if all humans are mammals and Socrates is a human, then it has to be the case. It just follows that Socrates is a mammal. Socrates, of course, is who is being talked about in the sentence. So Socrates here is the subject, just as it is in the second sentence, and mammal is the predicate. So we've used some of these we've used these terms before, previously in the argument. Socrates already has a variable. Mammal already has a variable. So we just repeat those variables. We don't give them new variables, right? We just use the same letters that we assign them. So all humans, since humans is a subject, we're just going to say A. You could say H if you want, or X, doesn't really matter. You can give it whatever variable you want, as long as you don't repeat the variable for new subjects and predicates. So all humans, A, we're going to assign A to humans. Are mammals, we're going to assign the variable B to mammals. Socrates doesn't yet appear in the first sentence, only appears in the second sentence, so we need to give Socrates a new variable. So we'll say C is a human. Since we already used human in the first sentence, we're going to give that, and that has the variable A. We're just going to use that variable again. So all humans are mammals. Socrates is a human. Thus, Socrates has the variable C that we gave in the second sentence, is a mammal. B that we gave in the first sentence. So all humans are mammals. Socrates is a human. Thus, Socrates is a mammal. And we can say this another way. All A are B, or all A's are B's. Socrates, or C is an A. Thus, C is a B. And that's what we get on the next slide here. So this is what we just went over. We went over this, so let's look here. So A is the subject, B is the predicate that we just talked about. So we're just adding the quantifier and the copula, and you can reference the video lecture where we went over in much detail, almost full detail, about categorical syllogisms, categorical logic. But I'm not going to go over it here, but you know to add the quantifier and the copula. So you get all A's are B's, C is an A, thus C is a B. This is the form. This is the logical form that this argument here takes. See how that's broken down? When we break down these sentences into their variables and then we add the quantifier and the copula, you can get this generic form. Now notice that if the premises are true, if it's true that all A's are B's, or all A are B, and C is an A, is it possible that C is not a B? No, it's not. It has to be the case. If this premise is true and this premise is true, it has to be the case that this is also true. C is a B. It's not possible for these to be true and this to be false. And what did I just, in other words, what did I just say? I just gave you the definition of validity. It's not possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false. That's just the definition, one way of saying that an argument is valid or has a valid form. Right? So given this form, we talked about substitution instances. And given this form, we can put whatever content we want to represent each of these variables. It doesn't matter what the content is. So I can say all humans, we would say humans would be A, mammals would be B, all mammals again would be B because we just assigned B to it in the first sentence. Animals is a new term that we're using, so we would assign that a new variable like C. Thus, all humans, A, are animals, C. So this is a substitution instance of this generic form. All humans are mammals are animals, thus all humans are animals. If this premise is true, and this premise is true, is it possible for the conclusion to be false? It's not. If this is true and this is true, this also has to be true. Why? Because it's just given the form. That's why you can substitute any content you want, any instance you want for these variables, and you're always going to get a valid argument, no matter what the content is. So let's look at another substitution instance. All emeralds are stones. All stones are objects. Thus, we can conclude all emeralds are objects. Has the same exact form. So if this is true, if the first premise is true and the second premise is true, it's not possible for the conclusion to be false. The conclusion, in other words, has to be true, and we can be certain of it. That's all we mean by a valid argument, and that's really all we mean by a deductive argument. A deductive argument is going to have a form that's always valid. It means that it's never going to be possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false. So I'm repeating this, the definition of valid over and over and over because we need to hear it over and over until it just becomes second nature and sinks in. So again, I mentioned that there's a slide with different ways of saying something is valid, different definitions, different ways of saying the concept of validity, but they essentially mean the same exact thing. So valid, one way of saying it, it's not possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false. Another way of saying it, as we've said it, is if the premises are true, then the conclusion must also be true. So in other words, in a deductive argument, we would say a deductive argument that is true to form and truly a deductive argument. If the premises are true, then the conclusion must also be true. Notice in the forms on the previous slides that if the premises are true, it's not possible for the conclusion to be false. So hopefully that's clear. If it's not, then just go back and rewatch it. You know, it's like riding a bike. Eventually it just kind of clicks and you get it. All right. So there's two ways to object to an argument and show a deductive argument in some sense is bad. And this might be a little misleading. I should probably take out the word deductive here. 2 ways to object to and show an argument is bad. Because technically, as I mentioned, an argument that is invalid is not a deductive argument. It's an inductive argument. So I'm going to take out, save this. I'm going to take out the word deductive there and just say argument generally. So 2 ways to object to and show an argument is bad. And we've gone over this before in class as well. So we can show that an argument is invalid. So an argument might have true premises, but faulty reasoning. By demonstrating that an argument has faulty reasoning, we demonstrate that the argument is invalid. In other words, we can demonstrate that an argument is invalid because it doesn't have a deductive form. It doesn't have a form such that the premises are true and the conclusion must also follow and be true. An invalid argument or an inductive argument is just going to be the kind of argument in which we can't be certain that the conclusion is true, even if the premises are true. Another way to show that an argument is bad is that it's unsound. So one way to evaluate arguments is to show that a premise is false. So an argument might be valid, it might have good reasoning, it might be truly deductive in form, but one or more of the premises is false or are false. In ineffective way, this is kind of irrelevant to this little summary lecture here, but an ineffective way to evaluate an argument is, merely to negate the conclusion. Say that the conclusion is not true. Somebody claims that something is true, and you kind of disregard the reasons why they think it's true. You can show that an argument's false by saying that the conclusion is false. But really, if that's the case, you want to show, you want to look at the reasoning behind it. So maybe it's not a deductive form, and you point out that in fact the conclusion's false, even though there might be true premises. Yeah, but that's really for our purposes here, neither here nor there. So of course, a deductive argument then is just defined by its form. Recall that an invalid deductive argument is not an actual deductive argument. So sometimes you're going to hear some people say, oh, that's an invalid deductive argument. That's actually a misnomer. That's not accurate. It's not correct. Because an invalid argument is not going to be a truly deductive argument. A truly deductive argument is going to have a form that's necessarily, by definition, valid. A deductive argument is going to have a form such that if the premises are true, you can be absolutely certain that the conclusion is true, because the conclusion will necessarily follow from the premises given its form. All right. So an argument may appear to be deductive, but there is in fact a flaw with the form. And that's why you have to kind of get good at recognizing invalid arguments versus valid arguments. Because if you can identify off the top of your head what an invalid argument looks like, say affirming the consequent or denying the antecedent, those are called formal fallacies that we've looked at. Then you're going to be able to tell right off the bat that an argument is bad because of its form. So, moreover, an invalid deductive argument just is, by definition, and I've already said this, an inductive argument. In other words, an invalid argument just is, by definition, an inductive argument. So I'm going to take this out because it's not an invalid deductive argument is a contradiction in terms. There's no such thing as an invalid deductive argument, even though you kind of sometimes hear it. It's an invalid argument, just as by definition an inductive argument. So look at the definitions we have here of invalid. It's possible that the premises are true and the conclusion false. And look at the definition of an inductive argument, an argument in which it's possible for the premises to be true, but the conclusion false. It's the same exact definition. So that's why invalid arguments are inductive arguments. That doesn't mean inductive arguments may not be strong arguments. So this is where the concept of weak and strong arguments come in. Weak and strong arguments, you might recall, do not apply to deductive arguments. Weak and strong arguments only apply to inductive arguments. So if you can establish that there's a high probability that the conclusion in an inductive argument is true, a high probability, maybe not certainty that it's true, but a high probability that it's true and that the premises are true, then you would have a strong argument. So it's not to say that just because an argument is invalid or inductive, that it's just like we shouldn't make inductive arguments. That's not what we're saying here. Inductive arguments are extremely important in human reasoning. That's typically the sorts of arguments that we as humans make. We make inductive arguments all the time, far more than we do with deductive arguments. At least in the non-hard sciences, or not in mathematics or something like that. So maybe in the social sciences or the law, and legal reasoning and legal analysis, then we're typically making inductive arguments. So inductive arguments are extremely important because we can make really strong inductive arguments, even though they don't guarantee the truth of the conclusion. Even when we have true premises, we can still establish a very high probability that the conclusion is true, and that's usually how we reason. So inductive arguments are extremely important, and they're central, of course, as we've learned throughout the semester, to scientific reasoning. Many of the sciences use inductive arguments. And some philosophers, like David Hume, would say, in fact, that all important arguments are inductive arguments. All new knowledge comes from inductive arguments. If you've noticed, deductive arguments are kind of true, we would say, like tautologically true or true by definition. So insofar as deductive arguments just are kind of, make arguments that are can be proven just by the truth being true by definition, then you might think, well, what good or what use are deductive arguments? And some philosophers have said that, some scientists have said that. So it's really inductive arguments that are important. So again, we'll recap this slide by saying, both deductive arguments and inductive arguments are both important. You just want to know the difference between them and when or which type of argument is useful and in what type of situation. But we don't have to go there right now. So let's compare valid and invalid forms. So a deductive argument, of course, is defined by its form. This is one of the forms we've looked at. All A's are B's, all B's are C's, thus all A's are C's. We can be absolutely sure that the conclusion follows from the premises, such that if the premises are true, the conclusion is also true. Substitution instance, all humans are mammals, all mammals are animals, thus all humans are animals. This is valid because, by definition, it's not possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false. Here's an argument that appears to be deductive. So you might hear somebody say, oh, it's an invalid deductive argument. Again, that's a contradiction in terms, but we're just going to say that the contradiction in terms arises from the argument appearing to be deductive, but it's not truly deductive because it doesn't have a form such that the truth of the premises will guarantee the truth of the conclusion. So an argument form may appear to be deductive, but it may not in fact be deductive. So if this is the case, then by definition, it will be possible for the premises to be true, but the conclusion false. So we might say no DL. So here's the form: no D are L. Some L are not C. Thus, some C are D. So we can. I'm not going to go over these quantifiers. We went over that in detail in our lectures in categorical logic. But this is a form that appears in categorical logic, but it's not a valid form. Why? Because it's possible for the premises to be true, and the conclusion false. So let's just assume that these are true. No dogs or lizards. That's true. Some lizards are not cute. Let's just assume that that's true. Does it follow then some things that are not cute are dogs? That could be true. It might be true, but it doesn't necessarily follow from the premises. Even if the premises are true, it does not follow that some things that are not cute are dogs. That's why this appears to be deductive, but it's not truly deductive because it doesn't have the right form, like, for example, this one here. This often gets presented in the very beginning of logic books. It gets presented at the beginning of our book that we're using for the course. This is a non-standard form. We call it valid. Technically, it's a non-standard categorical syllogism. And I explain that in detail why this is technically, after spending most of the semester using this, among others, as an example of a valid deductive argument, that this is technically not a standard categorical syllogism, but nevertheless, we're just going to say that it's valid. Whereas this is not, because it's possible that even if this is true and this is true, this conclusion does not follow. So no dogs or lizards. Some lizards are not cute. We can't conclude that some things that are not cute are dogs. That just doesn't fall out of the premises. So that's why this, since it's possible that the premises are true, but the conclusion is false, that's why it's invalid. Or in other words, that's why this would be more of an inductive argument form. And this is probably not even a strong inductive argument here. This wouldn't be a strong inductive argument. That would be kind of it would be weak because the logic, the reasoning just isn't great. Okay, so I just went over this. I'm not going to go over it again. But thus, this form is invalid. In other words, by definition, it is possible to have true premises, but a false conclusion. Note that, again, I'm just repeating this over and over. Note that the definition of invalid just is the definition of an inductive argument. So even in inductive arguments, even though that technically this is invalid and it's an inductive argument form, you probably wouldn't want to use something like this in an argument anyway, just because the form is kind of wonky. It's certainly not deductive. It's technically inductive, but it's still not great. Jumping from this premise to this conclusion doesn't really seem warranted anyway. So it would be a weak argument. So this argument form is weak. All right. Let me just reiterate. It appears deductive, but it's not deductive because it doesn't have the right form. So to review the right forms, you're going to want to go back to lecture, I think it's 12.1 on categorical logic. Go back and review that if you want to look at the main standard categorical syllogisms and the forms that are in fact valid. There are lots and lots of invalid categorical syllogisms that don't have the right kind of deductive form. There are many, many of those, and there are a bunch of valid forms, or what we would call standard forms as well. So if you want to review those, go back to that lecture. Now, so we've talked about validity and invalidity. Let's talk about soundness. This just means that for an argument to be sound, the truth values, that is the value of either being true or false, of the premises and conclusion must be true. All this means is that, in fact, the premises and the conclusion of, or we can back up. This just means that, in fact, the premises of the argument must themselves be true. And if it has the right deductive form, if it's a deductive argument, a genuine deductive argument, the conclusion will also be true. So what does that mean? And that just means a sound argument is on the one hand, a valid argument. So it's a deductive argument, it has the right form, and in fact, the premises are true. So if it has the right form and it has two premises, the conclusion will necessarily be true. So for example, let's look at this argument. A is a B, all B's are C's, hence A is a C. So for example, this is the generic form. We can plug in substitution instances with content for this form. So for example, A can represent Socrates, B can represent human being. Again, B is representing human beings or human being, and C represents mortal. So A is a B, all B's are C's. Therefore, A is a C. We can say Socrates is a human being. Socrates A is a human being, B. Human beings, B or B's, are mortal, C. Therefore, Socrates A is mortal, C. Or you could say more specifically, Socrates is a mortal being, something like that. So why is this argument sound? One, because it's valid. It has a valid form. It's not possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false. And because this first premise, Socrates was a human being or is a human being. Let's say that there's a guy in Greece right now named Socrates. I'm sure there are many. And we're just going to say Socrates is a human being. That's true. Human beings are mortal. That's true. Therefore, because it has this form and these two premises are true, and the conclusion, because of this form, necessarily follows from the premises, this has to also be true. And is it? Socrates is mortal. Yes. So as long as you have a valid argument, a valid form with true premises, you will always get a true conclusion. And that's why this argument is sound. Here's another substitution instance. My cat is a mammal. All mammals are animals. Hence, my cat is an animal. It has this form, so it's valid. Now, are the premises true? My cat is a mammal. Yep, that's true. Are all mammals animals? They certainly are. So we have a valid form with true premises. So we can, as long as it has this form, and it does, we can conclude my cat is an animal. And we can be absolutely certain that my cat is an animal is true, given the truth of the premises and given the form of this. It just has to follow. It has to be true, but almost by definition. So some people would look at this and think, this doesn't really tell me any new knowledge. So it does, but in a trivial sense. So if I say, Socrates is a human being and human beings are mortal, we can conclude Socrates is mortal. You might say, okay, yeah, but, who cares? You're not telling me anything new, really. If I know the premises to be true, the conclusion kind of just falls out of it. But these are really simple examples. Of course, arguments can get super, super complex, very, very, very complex. And if you ever take like an intro to logic course, you're going to learn about a number of complicated deductive argument forms and a number of rules. I think there are like total of 18 rules in propositional logic, for example, where you can get really, really complex arguments and figure out whether or not they're valid because of the argument forms. but we're not doing that. We're keeping this really simple, just to talk about the difference between validity, invalidity, and soundness. So let's look at some examples over here. These two arguments right here that fall under the heading valid and unsound, these two arguments all have this same exact form, which is the same exact form we got here. So we know that these two arguments are going to be valid. That means that if the premises are true, we can be absolutely certain the conclusion is true. But this is the question. Are the premises true in these two arguments? And that's why I state, I like to state the definition of valid in terms of a conditional. It just says in this definition, if the premises are true. It's not saying that the premises are true. It's just saying that if the premises are true. So if the premises are true, we can be certain that the conclusion is true. And by that definition alone, these are valid arguments. It's just saying if these are true, if these premises are true, we can be certain this is true. Why? Because it has this form. That's what makes it valid. So let's take a look at this. And we got to ask the question. So let's get out of the conditional statement of what validity is and check to see not if the premises are true, but are the premises in fact true? And we want to, in this way, we're going to check for soundness of the argument. So, first premise, my cat is a dog. All dogs are animals. Thus, my cat is an animal. It has this form. If the premises are true, we can be absolutely certain that the conclusion is true. It has this form. Therefore, it's valid. But are the premises true? Let's look at premise one. My cat is a dog. Nope, that's false. All dogs are animals. That's true. It happens to be the case that we get a true conclusion kind of by accident, by coincidence. Thus, my cat is an animal. Notice that the conclusion necessarily follows from this. So if the premises are true, we can be absolutely certain that this is true. But the premises are not, one of the premises is not true. This one is. But this first premise is not true. That's why this is valid, but it's unsound. It's not a sound argument because one of the premises is false. That's the difference between validity and soundness, right? Let's look at this next example. My cat is an animal. All animals are mammals. Thus, my cat is a mammal. This has the same form as this. My cat A is an animal, B. All animals, B, are mammals, C. Thus, my cat A is a mammal, C. It has that form. If the premises are true, we know that the conclusion necessarily has to follow. So this is valid. If my cat is an animal, and if it's true that all animals are mammals, then it has to be the case that my cat is a mammal. But now let's look at it for soundness. Let's check to see if this argument is sound. My cat is an animal. You maybe hear one of them. I have 3 cats. Maybe one of them's getting angry with another one, fighting over food probably. But in any case, is my cat an animal? Yes, that's true. All animals are mammals. Is that true? Are all animals mammals? That's false. Lots of animals are not mammals. Maybe most animals are not mammals. Probably, I think that most animals are not mammals. So, if we look at it just in terms of its form, if my cat is an animal, and if it's true that all animals are mammals, we can conclude with certainty that my cat is a mammal. So it's valid, but it's not sound. Why? Because premise 2 is false. So even though that this is a valid argument, my cat is an animal, and all animals are mammals, and thus, if those two premises are true, I can conclude that my cat is a mammal, and I can be certain of the truth that my cat is a mammal, and thus valid. It's still an unsound argument because the second premise is false. So an argument is sound, again, I'll repeat it, if and only if the argument is valid, it's a genuine deductive argument, true to form, and in fact, the premises are true. So here's a question for you. Is it possible to have an argument that is, let's say, valid and unsound if you have two true premises but a false conclusion? Because in this example here, we have, this happens to be, we happen to have two true conclusions, but one of the premises is false. So my question is it possible to have two true premises but a false conclusion, such that an argument in that sense would be valid and unsound? Think about it for a second. Is it possible to have a valid and unsound argument in which two or more premises, or one or more premises is true, but the conclusion false? It's not possible. That kind of argument would be invalid. Why? Just the definition of invalidity is an argument in which it's possible to have true premises and a false conclusion. So it is not possible to have it's not possible to have a valid and unsound argument in which the two premises are true, but the conclusion false. That is, by definition, an invalid argument. So the big walk away from this is really to memorize, not just memorize, but really understand the definition of validity, the definition of deductive argument, the definition of invalidity, the definition of inductive argument, and the definition of soundness. If you can memorize and truly understand those 5 definitions, you'll understand the difference between each of those and be able to tell arguments apart based on those definitions. So I hope this makes sense. I believe that's the end of this supplemental lecture. And I hope you found it helpful.